and the 3 oral health coalitions, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Oral Health Kansas. So let's take a look at the next screen. And this gives you the idea of this material right at the beginning. Look on the right-hand side of the computer. You'll see the panel to use to manage the webinar. You can reduce the panel by clicking the red arrow at the top. You'll also see the dial-in access number and code at the top of the panel, just in case you lose your phone connection and need to dial back in. You are encouraged to write comments and questions in this section. Just type question and message. We want to give our presenter the maximum amount of time for this presentation, and yet if there is time at the end, we'll use it for questions and answer. We will also then compile those questions and get back to everybody. So again, thank you for being here. As I said, my name is Marcia Manter. I'm the Community Development Specialist for Oral Health Kansas, and my partners Patty Urich and Cheryl Marsh Thompson and Brittany Crissell, all of our Michigan, Wisconsin, and Kansas coalition coordinators, and I'm here with Doug Bowman, who manages our Kansas coalitions. Our goal is really to initiate and establish community oral health coalitions, sometimes called local oral health coalitions. Our strong belief is that by improving the oral health of all people living in the United States, it takes national, state, and local commitments. We're excited with the large response to our invitation, more than 110, and I know that that is even a larger number because people have told me they're watching by teams or by groups in the office. So welcome to those who responded to the DentaQuest Foundation Basecamp members, the state oral health coalitions, and we'll do a poll right now to see who's here. Okay. Yes, we'll close it and let's see what we learn. So there are, Tanya, help me out here.
Hi, everybody. This is Tanya Dorf-Bruner at Oral Health Kansas. It looks like about 72% of the people on the webinar today are participating as members of a state or local oral health coalition.
That's pretty exciting. It is. And then we have one more quick poll. Want to know where people are working. What is the primary occupation for you? So take just a minute on this poll. So 42% nonprofit healthcare organization, 33% federal or state health agency, 4% dental provider organizations, and 22% oral health coalitions. So welcome to everyone. This is a very exciting webinar for us. It is the second in a series of 5. Gloria Medina was with us a couple of months ago and presented a very exciting and stimulating presentation on grassroots organizing. This is a follow-up. It is a presentation that Gloria has done for DentaQuest and for other oral health coalitions on power analysis. And so we're going to just turn this over to Gloria now. Gloria, thank you once again for being with us. We welcome you.
Good morning, and thank you for having me as one of the presenters for your webinar series. I just want to quickly just say that I'm actually having a little bit of technical difficulties and I can't see the slides. But I think we could do this. If you, as a whoever is managing the slides, if you could just let me know what slide number you're on, I think we should be able to get through this without any problems. So I'll be just kind of blindly going through this, but I think it'll be okay.
Okay, so this is Tanya. We're on the slide, the introduction slide, and I can go ahead and move you to the next slide. This is the
slide number 2?
Slide number 2.
Okay. So, so I'm actually very excited to bring the power analysis tool to all of you this afternoon. The power analysis tool is just one of the tools that we use here at Scope as we're doing community organizing, building and raising the voice of community members in South Los Angeles. And so it's really integrated into the whole scope of work that we're doing here. Over the years, as we've been doing work here, actually we've been in South LA doing this work over 20 years. And so we have had a chance to develop various tools to help us ensure that there is a science, right? So there is a very strategic and tactical way that we're actually doing the work. And that we're really thinking about building alliances and community power as we're forging new campaigns forward. So just to, again, I'm not, I thank everybody for being on the webinar and giving us a sense of who you are and what sectors you represent. Some of you might be already familiar a little bit with the power analysis tool. I've been very lucky that I've been able to share this tool in different spaces, in different oral health spaces with various coalitions across the country. And for us, this is very exciting. Scope started about 1.5 years ago with funding from DentaQuest, starting to focus our health equity work on oral health, and really beginning the conversation and applying really the methodology, really looking at campaigns and really engaging the community members who are part of Scope in this conversation about oral health, obviously with the lens of equity and social justice. And so during this time, this 1.5 years that we've been doing this work, the power analysis tool has been one of the tools that we have been able to use to help us analyze the current landscape and get a sense of where we're starting at. This tool so far has helped us ID some opportunities to engage community, to build coalition. It's also helped us to figure out what some of the challenges are, because definitely the landscape we're not doing our work in a vacuum, so we need to figure out what's going on in the landscape, and sometimes there can be challenges in the landscape, and really also helping us identify some strategies for IDing current conditions, possible solutions, and some strategies for winning. And so I just also wanted to say that the power analysis tool is typically a 3 to 6 hour introductory training. So definitely today this will be just a brief overview of the tool, and definitely I'm available if anybody wants to know more about the tool after this webinar. So as we're talking about coalitions and building coalitions, we understand that as we're working towards equity and as we're working toward creating long-term impacts, so we should be on slide number 3.
Yes, we are, yeah.
We know that we need to build these strategies, right? And we need to be very intentional about how we build power. So I hope that today's webinar will help increase your capacity to achieve your oral health goals. So the introduction to power analysis is designed for coalition members to identify and work with key people in their communities who can help meet their goals, right? So we know that no one organization or really no one coalition can do the work by themselves, right? That it's really an effort of coalitions and organizations and decision makers and community to really bring about change. So the webinar goals for today is that we will learn how to use this interactive tool. We will explore the meaning of power, and how we actually use power as individuals and as organizations, and we will explore strategies and tactics for building grassroots movements for creating positive change that, of course, move us towards social justice and equity. So that's what we hope to achieve today. And again, this is a snapshot, a brief overview. Before we get into the tool, we'll go to slide number 4. And we want to talk a little bit just to get some foundation of the way that we think about the tool, the way that we think about creating change, is that we think about it in terms of systemic change. So beyond just bringing more resources or bringing new projects or programs into the community, we're always thinking about the problems that our community face in like this larger sense. Really thinking about the systems that perpetuate and sustain the problems that our community faces. We know that our community faces multiple issues that historically have impact in our community, and so really thinking about how do we start changing the system in which we operate. We know that in order to change those systems, we must understand the root causes of inequities. So really thinking about the deeper causes, right? And sometimes that means having uncomfortable conversations about race, having conversations about economics, and really thinking about what are the conditions that are taking place in our communities that really help perpetuate these systems generation after generation. And so we know that the problems that we're facing are huge problems, right? They're systemic problems. And so that means that we need to really think about systemic solutions to build long-term power. So when we have those conversations about how do we create, for example, health equity or oral health equity, how are we making sure that our community members have access to quality oral health, we're also having the conversation about why is it that our community is being faced with a lack of opportunity and a lack of access to healthcare in general. So the next slide, number 5, we talk about, so as we're looking at this, we know that, as I mentioned, we need to look at the landscape because we know we're not doing this work in a vacuum. There's a lot of things going on in the political landscape that have an impact on our ability to do the work. So first thing is that we acknowledge that we are often fighting defensive battles in our community and that we're losing ground a lot of the time. And that we've been in this situation for at least the past 30 or 40 years. So, you know, it makes us think of things like affirmative action and unionized jobs and the welfare safety net that has always been on the chopping block in our communities. And so we are really thinking about moving away from defensive battles. And by that we mean not constantly fighting to protect what has been taken away or what is possibly at the chopping block, but really thinking of how do we think about creating change in our community long term before the problems even manifest themselves, or even before, for example, the welfare safety net is being reduced in our community. So really it's about being strategic. The second thing is that we know that there are ideas that are dominating our society, and not only our larger society, but our own community of color. Our low-income communities are bombarded by these dominating ideas through media, and sometimes they themselves integrate these ideas into their daily lives and the way that they treat other people. So, for example, when we talk about the battle of ideas, we're talking about, you know, what we commonly hear when people say that people on welfare are just lazy, or that people really don't care about their oral health, or that people just, you know, rather prioritize, people in our communities rather prioritize other issues instead of providing oral health for their children. And so these are ideas that dominate the larger narrative. And so we constantly are thinking of how do we really talk about these ideas with our community members, and also how do we start building a narrative that really tells the story about our community members and the situation in which they live in. The third major factor is that organizations and movements for progressive social change, or groups that are doing social justice change, are often fragmented, isolated, and marginalized. And so we need to constantly think about how we're building coalition in order to build power for our community members. So thinking about how do we work with groups that we traditionally don't work with, right? If we're a social justice organization, asking ourselves, are there service providers in the community who we can actually work with? Asking ourselves, are there advocacy groups in the community who we can actually work with? And so really thinking about how we unite forces and really make sure that we're leveraging the resources that we all bring to the table in order to really make sure that we can win these changes for our community members. The next slide, creating social justice change, really then talks about the fact that, you know, we are actually doing this work in this landscape that may make her work a little bit difficult, but really then thinking about what is our theory of social change. So how do we theorize about how we can actually bring change about in our community? So the first thing that we think about is power relationships. So we understand that power relationships are unequal at this time, and that needs to be really at the forefront of the conversation. The primary reason why our problems and conditions in our communities continue generation after generation is because the folks in our communities don't have the power that they need to actually bring about the change. So the work that we do, always thinking about, for example, oral health equity, we're always thinking about what opportunity do we have as we're launching a new campaign around oral health to really shift the power equation so that our community members can start having a little bit more power. The second thing is that in order to permanently change the conditions, as we talked earlier, in order to permanently change the system, we need to build collective power. So again, talking about building the power with community members and really addressing the fact that we as organizations might be isolated, marginalized, and not working together, really thinking about how do we build that collective power and what is that strategy for long-term systemic change. The third piece of our theory is that at the forefront, we need grassroots space. So those who are most impacted, those that live the actual situation, those that know the issue firsthand, are the folks who need to be at the forefront. That means they need to identify the problems and conditions that are priority for them, and they need to help us come up with a solution because they have a very clear understanding of their own community. And so that means that we actually help build that base by providing political consciousness, political training, and building their leadership skills. And lastly, the fourth thing is that we use a more systemic way of understanding power. So this means that this is why we need the power analysis. We need to be able to have a conversation about what the landscape is, what the political landscape is. What are we actually being confronted with? What are the challenges in the landscape and what are the opportunities? And so that we know that a lot of times the folks who oppose us or who do not want to actually create change, they have a pretty good understanding of power. They have power, they have relationships with people who have power, they can influence people with power. And so we think that as community members and as grassroots organizations, we also need to understand power in order to actually create the change that we need. Going on to the next slide, then the question is, what is power? So we need to know what power is, and we have this conversation with community members and our coalition members in terms of how do we define that, right? And power can be defined in different ways depending on what end of power you're at. If you are someone who has power, you might define it a little bit different than someone in the community who the only power that they know and understand is the power that has been exercised upon them. So we have that conversation with our community members and start figuring out or help them figure out what potential power they have. So there's different types of power, but we define it as that power is the ability or capacity to achieve and win a collectively agreed upon goal. So this means that it's we have the power to change our community in a way that it's actually impacting, in a positive way, impacting the community as a whole, right? So it's not for personal benefit, but it's for community benefit. So think about this definition of power as we go into the power analysis, because this is what we're trying to actually build when we say analyzing the landscape to build power. Is really building that our capacity and the capacity of our community members and the capacity of our alliance and our coalitions to actually be able to win something that is for the good of the community. So the next slide here shows some of the different types of organized power that we engage our community members in. So, you know, we have a conversation about what advocacy is and the role that advocacy plays in social justice. We talk about, obviously, community organizing as that is what we do. That's the forefront, at the hub of the work that we do is community organizing. So how do we actually identify the people who need to be organized? What is the message that we actually need to develop to engage them? What is the science that we're going to be using, the science of numbers, to actually reach our goals of really building enough power? We also know that there's power in voting. So we also talk about our electoral block and how do we build a base of voters who could actually shift the power equation. And so SCOPE also, besides doing community organizing, also is involved in voter engagement programs. We know that there's power in direct action. So a lot of times when people think of community organizers, they think of direct action, right? That might be a walkout, a rally, a sit-in. And so we do engage in direct action, but that is not the bulk of our work. The bulk of our work is really building those relationships with community members through community organizing and organized voting. But we also think about mass media and think about the power or lack of power that we have to really influence the mass media. And so that means, how are we actually coming to the table as community to really shift the narrative about the way that people think about our community and the issues that impact our community, and really think about how we can really start developing a frame or a narrative of our community. We know that legal power is important, and sometimes as community members and as organizations we don't have much legal power, but really thinking about who has the legal power and how do we leverage that power. Financial power we know is important, and so always thinking as coalitions, how do we build our financial power? As community members, how do we build our financial powers to have an impact? And then also thinking about influence and positional power, thinking about who has the power to make the decision, who has the power to influence the decision maker, and what type of relationship or connection do we have with those folks. So the questions that we have next is really just to help you think about these different types of organized power and think about what type of power your coalition currently has, right? So your coalition, given who the membership is and given what your expertise is, you might have maybe advocacy power, maybe you have some legal power, some mass media power, maybe you have some power to influence the decision maker. But then you need to think about the other pieces, right? Do you have power in terms of organizing community members? Do you have power in actually building a base of voters and direct action also? So thinking about what is missing in your coalition and what is the strategy to actually build the capacity. The next slide is then just one definition that I have here is the definition on target. So when I talk about target, as I go through the power analysis, what I'm talking about is not the person who is against us, not the opposition. A lot of times we think about power and changing power equations as us, the community, and them, the opposition. But when we talk about target, what we're really talking about is who has the power to say yes or no to our demands or our campaign goals. So this is a decision maker. It usually includes a governor, state legislator, city council, some state agency. It might be the director of your local agencies. So really thinking about the target being where we're going to put our focus and trying to build relationship with that person or those group of people, because they're the people who could actually support or oppose our agenda. And the target is not always against us. Sometimes we find a target who from the very beginning is in support of our campaign. And sometimes we find that the targets are not in support of our campaign. They're actually supporting the opposition, and we need to find strategies on how to move them towards our agenda so that they can really understand what's going on in community. The next slide. So this is our grid. Again, we're going to go through it briefly. So this is our power analysis grid. It's very straightforward and simple, and it's very interactive and visual. You will notice that it has, we use very many colorful icons. And one of the reasons that we do this is because we also use this as a popular education tool. So this is a tool that we actually use with our community members to help them also think about the landscape, right? We want them to also be able to understand the strategy and to really be able to understand what is possible in terms of winning a campaign, and for them to also understand that we're actually moving the work, even if they can't see the exact outcomes right away, right? So we might be, for example, fighting for more funding for oral health equity, and that might take a couple of years. It might take 6 months, it might take a year, it might take 2 years to actually win some sort of concrete, meaningful funding to come into, for example, South LA. But in the meantime, we want them to also have an idea of what else we're building, right? It's not just the win of the funding, but it's also building relationships with decision makers, building relationships with other allies, understanding the opposition better, engaging more community members in the fight or in the campaign, having a better understanding of what's happening in the political landscape. And so our community members then become leaders as they're really being part of this conversation and understanding the political landscape. So in this grid, you will notice there's two main things. We have, on the top, we have our agenda and the opposing agenda, which is they're the competing agendas. And so we identify what is our agenda, and that's specifically on whatever campaign or whatever goal we have as a coalition, right? What is it that we specifically want to win? And really thinking about the specific demands that we're asking our decision makers for. And then the opposing agenda is thinking about the folks who are going to oppose us. What are they thinking? Thinking about how they're either benefiting politically, economically, or financially by keeping the problems and conditions or keeping the systems intact and keeping them the same, not wanting change. A lot of times, the opposing agenda we also identify as kind of as a status quo. You know, sometimes there's decision makers who just don't want to create change because they're used to doing things the way that they've done them for a very long time. The second thing that you will notice on the grid is that we have a vertical and horizontal line. So you will notice, for example, on both of these lines that we have a black rating scale and a red rating scale on both vertical and horizontal. Right now, we're only going to be concentrating on the black rating scale. So let me start by looking at the black rating scale vertically. You will notice that it goes from a 2 to a 10. 2, someone who's not on the radar. 3, someone who can get attention. 4, someone who's taken into account. 6, someone who has power to have influence over the decision maker. 8 is someone who's actually part of the decision-making process. Right, so they're at the table, they're maybe advisors, or they're part of maybe a committee. But 10 is the decisive ultimate decision maker, so who has the power to say yes or no. So on this scale, we're identifying, as we identify different people in the landscape, we start identifying how much power they have, but in relationship to the agenda, right? So for example, if we talk about South LA or Los Angeles, we might say that maybe the mayor is the person who has the most power. and we might be inclined to put him on the power analysis as a 10. But we need to look at our agenda. If our agenda is about oral health, then maybe the mayor is not the ultimate decision maker. So we can put the mayor up here if we would like to, but maybe the mayor is more of an influencer because maybe they can influence whoever's making the decision about county health budgets instead of the mayor. So again, the people that we're placing and identifying in terms of how much power they have are connected to the agenda, the current agenda at hand. Now let's move to horizontally. Horizontally, you will notice that we have a black rating scale from +3 to -3. And here we think about where folks that we're putting on the power analysis, where their support lies. Are they a die-hard supporter, an active supporter, or inclined supporter towards our agenda? Or are they a -1, -2, -3 supporting the opposing agenda? And this is really important because we need to investigate and research and figure out where people are at in terms of their support so that we can decide who do we need to move by maybe having meetings with them, conversations with them, sending them a report, having community members testify about the current conditions in the community so that we can actually move them to our side. So this is the grid itself, and we're going to go on to the next slide. And you will notice that we actually, this is what the completed power analysis might look like. So the power analysis actually has 8 steps to complete it. The power analysis is not a tool that you just complete once and then put away, but it's a tool that might help you for various things. The main goals, or the main uses, I should say, of the power analysis tool is, 1, to help us identify the problems and conditions and therefore identify what our campaign is going to be, right? So starting from scratch, really looking at where is it that we want to put our effort in terms of building a campaign. What is it that we actually want to focus on this year to win? So it helps us identify issues. The second thing that it helps us do is track our work. So it's helping us track that if we said, for example, that we need to really work on building relationships with the decision makers and move them towards our agenda, it really helps us track that. Are we doing that? Are we meeting with the decision maker? Are we having any impact or influence on them? Are we moving them to our side? And then it also helps us, the third thing that it helps us do, the power analysis helps us define or kind of redefine our strategy, right? So we might be doing this work and then 6 months down the line we realize, we're not moving this campaign. It's just not moving. So it might be that our strategy is not working. It might be that this campaign is not viable at this political time. And so the power analysis helps us identify whether we continue with this campaign, whether we continue with the same strategy, or how do we kind of regroup and re-strategize. And then lastly, the other use for the power analysis is to evaluate. So once we have won a campaign with our community members, we then do a power analysis and then figure out what is it that we built, right? Beyond winning, whether we won an ordinance or we won funding or we won a program, beyond that, what else did we build in the process? Did we actually move folks more towards our agenda? Did we actually increase the number of community folks that are involved in our work? Did we build a strong coalition? Are we working with groups who we hadn't worked with in the past? So really thinking about how we're actually building long-term change and not only looking at evaluating whether we won our campaign and our goals. So when you finish a power analysis, it might look something like this. So I'm going to go through each of the steps, and I'm going to actually use an example of a group who I helped do a power analysis, and they did a power analysis based on school nutrition. And so the power analysis that I'm going to show you is just to give you an example of who the actual folks that we actually plot on the power analysis might be. But again, it's a very simplistic, very kind of broad case study of the work that this group did. So we're going to go on to the next slide. And we are on step 1, which is the clouds. So on step 1, you will see that our goal on step 1 is to define the major problems and conditions which are impacting our community. So the clouds are usually, we put them in the middle and all the way in the top, just because we're not actually rating them on any of the scales, right? They're just the problems and conditions. And the reason why we put them up there is because we want to make sure that our community members and our coalition members always keep in mind what is it that we're trying to impact, right? So that we can keep the focus on our work. So these parents that I worked with, they identified that there was an increased rate of diabetes in children in their community. They were seeing that there was a lack of access to fresh and nutritious food. So some parents were saying that they would have to take 2 buses to get to the nearest market or the nearest farmer's market where they could actually get good nutritious food. And that the school meals at their local school district was really high in fat and salt, and that this was important for them because a lot of the children in the community highly relied on the 2 school meals, breakfast and lunch, for their nutrition, just because there was a lack of food at home. And so that was step number 1. And so we try to keep it at 2 to 3 problems and conditions, because again, it's focus. What are we trying to impact in this very specific campaign? There's a lot of problems that might be connected, for example, to oral health, but we're not gonna find a solution for all of them in one campaign, right? So identifying in this specific campaign, what are the problems and conditions that we want to focus on. Step number 2 is then identifying the competing agendas. Again, so I already talked about this, right? So parents, in a very broad way, what they identified as their agenda at the very beginning was that they wanted access to healthy school meals for their children, and that they wanted to really have a health equity lens at school, and that they wanted a holistic approach to strategies for education. And by that, what they meant is, we could look at the opposing agenda. This is, that basically those that were making the decisions always looking at profits before community health, always kind of looking at where they could cut in education in terms of budgets, and then that the focus on academic indicators that was the focus. Academic indicators was the focus for allocation of funds. And so parents wanting to have conversations with decision makers about the fact that if children are not eating right and they have diabetes or other health problems, that they will not be functioning in school. And that if children are continually absent from school and missing many instructional hours, then that's also not a successful strategy for school. And so that the parents wanted to make sure that there was this holistic approach of looking at nutrition and looking at recreational activity as a way to really reach the academic indicators. So then we go on to number 3, step number 3, which is then looking at policy and issue battles. So and then these are related to the problems and conditions, right? So we ask the question that we ask is, what else is going on in the landscape that might have a negative or maybe even positive impact on our campaign? And here you will notice I have it in red because this is where we use the red rating scale, both horizontally and vertically. That's it's in the outer edge. So let's start vertically. When we identify a battle, an issue or policy battle, we then ask ourselves, what type of, how many people does it influence? Does it influence thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands? Obviously, these numbers are going to change depending if you're in an urban or rural area. But really thinking about the more impact that it has on the community, on different sectors of the community, the higher it goes. So some of the 3 examples that I have here, parents were thinking about, for example, the farm bill, and that would go really high up, just because the farm bill obviously is a federal bill and it impacts a lot of people and a lot of children. And so they were looking at the farm bill because this is where some of the money trickles down for food programs at the local level. They were also looking at upcoming board elections. So they knew that some of the allies that they had within the board, within the school board, were actually being turned out. And so really thinking about who was going to replace them and what type of support they could get from them. And then also the other one is the school district budget. So the parents identified this because they needed to figure out what was going on within the district budget. As they were cutting funding for the budget that year, was food services going to be reduced in terms of funding, or was there an opportunity to increase the funding? So although these are battles, issue and policy battles that maybe the community or your coalition or ally or alliances are not working on specifically, but definitely these are battles that we need to keep an eye on because they might have an impact on us being able to win. So horizontally, you will see that we have, you could actually place them from right to left, from being a long-term damage, mid-term damage, short-term damage, all the way to being a long-term solution. So really thinking about the conversation and the decisions that are being made in that policy battle, are they actually, the way that they're being talked about, the decisions that are being made, or do they really result in a damage or a solution for our work? So we can go on to the next slide, and it'll be step number 4. So step number 4, we identify who are the actual decision makers, or as I identified earlier, the targets. These are the targets because this is where we're going to spend the majority of our time and focus. We're not going to spend our time trying to convince the opposition to support us, but we do want to spend our time and our capacity really being able to educate the decision makers so that they can actually say yes to our demands. So these folks, these parents identify the school board president, the school board itself, and local school principals as possible decision makers or possible targets. So at the very beginning, they put them in these triangles and start to place them whether they're actually supporting our agenda to the left or the opposing agenda to the right, and how much power they have from a 2 to a 10. Again, using the Black rating scale. As time went by, then the parents were able and the organizations were able then to identify that the local school principals really didn't have decision-making power. So instead of putting them high up, like here I have them as a possible 8, they then pulled them down maybe to a 6 or a 4. There's someone who is taken into account in the decision-making process or who has influence over the decision makers. But really, at the end of the day, it was the school board and the school board president who were the decision makers. In terms of the school board triangle, later what they did is then add a triangle for every school board member, right? So if there was 5 school board members, then they added 5 triangles with the names of the school board members, because all of the different school board members were at different levels in terms of power and also in terms of support for our campaign. And so then that helps you start thinking of the strategy. Do we really need to actually target all 5 board members, or do we need 3 votes, right, for example? And so do we need to identify 3 board members who we could actually move to support our agenda? So again, having our community members and our coalition member and our ally members really think about strategy to actually, again, think about long-term solutions. The next one is number 5, and here what we do is look at the opposition. So we need to know who's going to oppose us, not necessarily because they're our targets, but because we need to identify what type of relationship they have with the decision maker. So are they actually, who are they, and how much power do they have? How closely connected are they to the decision maker? So in this specific case study, in this example, they identified the teachers' unions, the major meal vendor, the current meal vendor, who was definitely not going to want a new healthy school lunch, And then the vending machine vendors, right? So thinking about folks who are actually benefiting financially from, making sugary beverages and junk food available at schools. I want to say that the opposition is, you need to look at the opposition in connection to your agenda. So just to say that your opposing groups might be an opposing group in one campaign, but not necessarily an opposing group on another campaign. It depends on where people are on different issues. So as an example, this group identified the teachers union because the teachers were actually fighting for more funds or more investment in testing, state testing preparation. So they were going to fight back allocation of funds into nutrition and food, just because they also had an interest, right? But this group also had worked with the teachers union in the past on other campaigns where they agreed on. So in that case, the teachers union were no longer in opposition. So again, just to say that oppositions change, people's relationship to your campaign and your work, your coalition change depending on the issue. This takes us to step number 6 that makes us then really think about so these green squares, thinking of who are the sketch organized allies. So as the example I just gave about the teachers union, it could be that in another campaign, the teachers unions are not put in the pink square, but actually put in one of these green squares because they might be an ally. So here we start thinking about who are the folks that are at the table already in our coalition, helping us with trying to create change in our campaign, in our community. But also thinking about the non-traditional folks out in the community, groups in the community who maybe we haven't engaged. So helping us think outside of the box. Who else is in the community, who cares about the community, who maybe has an interest in oral health, who we could actually bring to the table. And these are organized groups. So really thinking about groups that have some power, right? Whether it's a 2 or a 3, but they have some sort of organizational form. That might be a local PTA. It might be a local university that might have a department that does work around equity, who maybe does some research, who maybe already has the ear of the decision maker in terms of health equity, and so they can be a good ally. Thinking about other groups, community organizing groups. So for example, if your coalition has expertise maybe in advocacy, in program development, but maybe doesn't have an expertise in community organizing, really thinking about who are the groups out in the community who are doing grassroots organizing, and can we engage them in our campaign or in our fight for change. And really thinking about how do we bring him into our coalition. And also just to say that allies will be engaged and supportive at different levels. So some of our allies will be number 3, diehard. Other ones will be active supporters, and others will be just inclined towards. So when we engage in community campaigns, we know that maybe a local academic center is a positive one. They're willing for, they name themselves as a coalition member. We can use them in our coalition letterhead. They might put out a report for us, but maybe they're not coming to all of the meetings. Maybe they're not coming to all of the strategy meetings because it's not the focus of their work or they don't have the capacity. So really thinking about not only who's at the table, but thinking about at what level they're engaged, and also thinking about what they can bring to the table to leverage in terms of building power. Number 7. So step number 7, then we start thinking about who are the actual unorganized groups in our community, the unorganized social sectors. So the key word here is unorganized. This is not the PTA. This might not be the local organized AYSO soccer team. This is just identifying the groups of people in our community that we can engage in this fight. So again, looking at your agenda, right? If your agenda, as in this case study, is to actually create healthier school lunches, being able to make sure that the school lunches are low in fat, low in salt, and that the school is prioritizing recreational justice and food justice, there's adequate funding. So if, for example, if that is your agenda, then thinking about who are the folks in the community who actually are going to be most engaged in that campaign. So here, the group that I was working with, they identified families of school-age children. They also identified parents with children with diabetes and low-income families. So an example of why this is important is because we don't have the capacity to go out and talk to every single family in the community. In South LA, for example, we are a population, just in South LA area, population of over 1 million people, close to 1 million people. And we have 8 organizers in our team. So how do we do that? How do we make sure that we're targeted? How do we make sure that we are using our capacity as effectively as possible? So we have this conversation. We say we do an analysis of the community and figure out who we're going to target. In this case, you know, if it's parents with children with diabetes, we know that they might be the folks who might be most interested in making sure that their children are eating healthier at school. They might be the families who actually have high rates of absenteeism in schools, right? And for their children are not going to school, and so how are these the folks who are going to be most engaged and most interested in making sure that their children can be healthier? The other thing is identifying families of school-age children, right? Like, which schools are we talking about? Are we going to target all schools in the community, or are we going to do a targeted effort to maybe identify 4 to 6 schools in our community where that's where we're going to start? And we're going to send our community organizers after school to meet parents outside. Parents are picking up their children. Maybe it is that our coalition offers a free workshop on healthy eating at these local schools and invite parents. And maybe we target children who have high absentee rates or children who are chronically ill at that school, and we invite their families to come to this free workshop. And that's a starting way, a way to start building relationship with these families, and then start telling them about our campaign and the fact that we want to help them with just more than just the workshop, that we actually want to change the system, that we actually want to change the way that decisions are made so that they can actually have access to healthy foods and healthy meals in their community and in schools. So that is step number 7. Step number 8 then is stepping back, pausing, and analyzing the picture. So figuring out, what does the picture tell us? What is the strategy that we're getting out of this conversation, right? That might help us not only win our campaign, but change the power equation. So for that, it means thinking about strategies that would actually increase the voice of our community members, so that our community members actually building their leadership skills, building their political consciousness, building relationships with decision makers, so that we're building a stronger coalition with more members that could actually leverage power for us. Really thinking of what are the strategies to really build relationship with the decision maker. Not only our community members building relationship with decision makers, but our organization and our coalition by name being able to influence the decisions that are being made in these centers. So really looking at the strategies. So that's step number 8. So we'll go on to the next slide and work back to the completed power analysis. So this is, again, just giving you an idea of this interactive space where we have this conversation, not only in spaces where community members are present, but also with our coalition members. And so we do this in PowerPoint, just like I'm doing it today, making sure that we have all of these different pieces on this PowerPoint grid. But also we do cutouts where it's actually, we put it out on a big wall, and we make the grid with tape, and we make it really interactive, so then community members could actually then have this conversation with us and start shifting all of these different folks. This helps also, as we're doing our power analysis, we try to do our power analysis, look at it every 3 months, and so then we're starting to shift, right? And so this helps us bring our community members and help them see that we are actually moving the work, right? So maybe we haven't won the healthy lunches yet. Maybe we don't have a new school lunch program yet. Maybe it's going to take a year to get us there. But at least we're engaging community members so that they are understanding that we're actually engaging board members, right? We're actually going and they're giving testimony to board members, or we're actually collecting surveys from the community to actually inform a report that is going to the decision makers, to the school boards. And so then they're really part of the strategy. They're really then identifying all of the different tactics along the way and being able to connect it to how we're actually shifting the power equation, how they're actually becoming more powerful as their voice is being heard in the landscape. Just to say here, some of the things that came out of this specific example is that when I say that the power is a tool that we can use for identifying issues, for tracking our work, for redefining our strategy, for evaluating our campaign at the end, is that the folks who did this work with this very specific case study, they realized that they could not bring healthy school lunches to every single school from K to 12 in their local school district. It was too big, and it was going to take way more than that. But they wanted to win something the first year, to start engaging parents. And so what they did is that their agenda then became a pilot project instead. And so they decided that they wanted a pilot project in 6 schools that they had identified, and they were schools that were K through 6 only. And they decided they were not going to work in the high school schools that year. So it was a pilot project where they actually were able to start getting funding to have a community garden that was managed by the local parents. That local community garden then became a salad bar at the school, and then these 6 schools also adopted a healthier lunch menu, which was not only healthier in terms of low salt and low fat, but it was also determined by the needs of the community in terms of what the children were culturally used to eating at home, so that the children would not be throwing the school lunch away, but actually it was something that they wanted to eat. And so then they worked on this for about a year. They won the pilot project. They won some funding for the pilot project. The next year they started then evaluating the program, collecting data, making sure that they could highlight how this was having an impact on the children, not only in health, but also in academic indicators. And then they moved on to then having a bigger fight the next year. Then they used the power analysis to then identify how they can move from a pilot project to a campaign that would take them to the next level, where they were actually asking for a permanent project, a permanent program for schools K through 6. So again, even though they started with this intention of making a change across all schools from K to 12 throughout the school district, they realized using the power analysis and looking at all of the different moving pieces that at that moment it wasn't viable. And so really thinking, what can we actually win this year? But more importantly, what could help build community power this year? Right? They knew that if they went for the whole campaign, or the whole goal of actually changing all of the school meals the first year, that maybe they might not win. And if they didn't win, that might have an impact on their future ability to engage parents, right? And so really thinking what was something that parents could actually, or community members could actually be involved in, excited about. And what was actually something that could get them closer to the decision makers so that they could start building some relationships with decision makers. And so that they were known, right? So that they were starting to actually build the narrative, construct the narrative around health in schools, food justice, and what does food justice mean in their community, and the fact that they are a food desert, right, and that there is a need to look at the community and create change so that there could be healthier community members, not only just for schools and for children to be ready and able to learn, but also for parents to be healthy and ready and able to be employed. So the next slide, then these are the kind of the three main pockets of questions that we ask ourselves as we're analyzing the landscape, right, as we're looking at the power analysis. So identifying opportunities to leverage community power, right, so which I've talked about a lot already. So how do we actually win our overall goals and agenda, but not how do we win it as a coalition, right? Because we could actually win some of these demands and goals as a coalition. We might have enough power. But the question is, how do we actually leverage community power to win? If as a coalition we win on our own without community support, then we're not building long-term systemic change. We're creating change. We might create one program, we might create one source of funding, but as we're looking at leveraging community power, what we're actually looking is at long-term systemic change. How can we build a powerful voice of the community so that they could be at the table, so that they can be part of the decision-making process towards a healthier community? The next question that we ask ourselves is, what are the challenges, right? And there might be various challenges. There might be the fact that we don't have the capacity to influence the decision maker at this time. It might be that we don't have the funding to actually move the campaign forward. So what is that challenge? And so what are the alternatives, or what is the strategy to actually address that challenge? If it is that we don't have the funding, maybe then we need to look at our coalition and figure out who do we need to bring to the table who could actually leverage some funding. Really thinking about what relationships we need to build with other decision makers who maybe are not the ultimate decision maker, but who could possibly leverage some funding for us, or who could help us identify some of that funding that we're not even thinking about. So really looking at the challenges with a lens of really thinking of strategies to get around those challenges. And then the last thing that we ask ourselves is these questions around, what don't we know? So sometimes when coalitions do the power analysis, they get frustrated because then they realize we're just identifying all of the things that we don't know. We do know some things, but we're realizing that there's a lot that we don't know about the landscape. You might know a lot about the issue, but maybe there's a lot of questions about the landscape and the opportunities. And so we tell groups that that's a good sign. If you're actually coming up with questions after doing the power analysis, that means that you're doing the power analysis right. We don't know all of the answers. We don't know the landscape well at the very beginning, but part of the work is identifying those questions and then finding the research that is needed to actually being able to have a more informed strategy by answering those questions. And so, again, looking at the opportunities, the challenges, and what are some of the research questions that need to be answered in order to have a better idea of what the landscape is. So I am going to stop right here for any questions or any needs for clarification.
Hello, everyone. This is Marcia Manter again from Oral Health Kansas. Gloria, thank you so much. You did more than an hour without taking a breath, and it was an amazing presentation. I think all of us around our table here at Oral Health Kansas were thinking of all of these steps that we might take, and also appreciating how long it might take. I do want to ask everyone to write some questions or comments in the box, if you will, and then we're going short poll, so we won't close it out just yet. And so wanting to know if you've used this. I know several people on this call, or maybe more than that, have heard Gloria do this and have worked through it. So interested if anybody has been using it, haven't used it, or my favorite question these days is not yet. Any responses?
We're getting, most people have either said no or not yet.
This is Tanya talking. I think what came to my mind with putting a bit of my spin on all of the learning that I've just had over the hour from Gloria is that we have an advantage right now, just as a beginning, that we are in now the heat of the major political campaign, meaning in Kansas anyway, we've gone through the primaries, and that may be true for other states. And so now as we look at local school boards, state school boards, looking at people running for the legislature, I'm going to make an assumption here about the commitment that we all have to improving the oral health of all Americans. What an opportunity to begin to understand, look at the power, look at the influence, thinking about people who may win or will win their election to local and state and national offices, as beginning to build relationships with them. I do also want to say, Gloria, you were talking about not just the PTA, but families, parents of children, grandparents of children, teachers, the people working in the kitchens of the school districts, how we also begin from a grassroots organizing to reach out to build those kinds of relationships. Tanya, do we have any questions from people?
We do. I was going to close the poll too, maybe. How about we go ahead and close the poll so you can see the answers. We've got a couple of questions. One question was, great presentation. Will it be available for a second listening? And yes, we most certainly will be posting a recorded copy of the presentation. We also had another good question. Somebody agreeing with you, Martin, that the presentation was very good. I just clicked in the wrong place. Hold on. And the question was, one of the most useful tools I've seen presented, have you ever used this process specifically with youth? I think that's to you, Gloria.
Gloria?
Was the question with youth?
Young people.
Mm-hmm. Okay. With young people. Yes, most definitely. So as I had mentioned earlier, this is Scope Power Analysis tool. There's other versions of power analysis that I'm not very familiar with, but and just to say that, you know, as we're having conversations and coalitions and kind of thinking about our strategy, we all have these conversations, right? There's different parts of these conversations that we do have. The good thing about the power analysis is that it's all in one place, and it helps us make sure that we're actually looking at all of the different pieces of the landscape that are important. And so I say that because as we have been using the power analysis at Scope, specifically in South LA, we work in coalition and in alliances with many other groups in the greater Los Angeles. And so many of our partners, many of our members, our coalition members, do other work. So they might be doing some work with us on a very specific issue. Maybe it's around oral health or workforce development, but they might also be doing some other work. And some of our, we have youth that support our work and identify as Scope members, but we have other coalition members who they actually specifically organize youth. So all of their membership, 100% of their membership are young people. And so they have, because they have been able to integrate the power analysis in the work that they do with Scope, they've also taken the power analysis and they have adapted it I shouldn't say adapted it, they have integrated into the work that they're doing with youth. And so I have also, besides doing the training, I also do technical assistance, and so I have been able to go to those groups, youth organizing groups, and been able to help young people not only introduce them to the tool, but have a deeper conversation about power and the importance of building community power, but also helping them strategize around a very specific campaign.
Thank you so much. This is Marcia again. Gloria, there is a question about would you share the slides. I'm going to let you make that decision. Gloria's email address, I believe, is on the last slide. Tanya, if you would move over to that last slide for people. So I would ask you to ask her that directly. I think that the one piece that I would add, only from my perspective, is a realization of how long a process can take. The patience that we have, all of us who are working in collaboration across the country with the DentaQuest Foundation, working on our 2020 goals of incorporating oral health into Medicare, oral health services funding into Medicare, having the vast numbers of children reach kindergarten cavity-free, beginning to build all of our local coalitions established and working on a variety of issues that are extremely important to them. This has been very helpful. I just want to thank all of you around the country who I can't remember now, 115 logged in, so we know there probably are maybe up to, I don't know, maybe 150 who are hearing this and responding. We look forward. Feel free to write Gloria, feel free to write Oral Health Kansas about what you learned, what you're doing, because I think we all want to learn from all of you. So again, Gloria, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone.
We've got another good question, Marcia.
Okay, go ahead.
This is Tanya. We've got another great question from the Oregon Oral Health Coalition. Gloria, do you find it best to conduct the power analysis as a whole coalition or with a targeted subgroup? Kind of the subtext is, are more voices better in conducting the power analysis, or is it better to be kind of a smaller group?
That's an excellent question. So I think it's a good question, as I encourage all of you to start thinking about what are the concrete ways that you can integrate this or experiment with this tool, like in what spaces it would make most sense. So our experience is that we use it in different settings. So for example, when we're starting a campaign, so I'll use the example of, if this larger goal of having children enter kindergarten cavity free. So that's a huge goal. It's an amazing goal, but it's big. And so thinking about what can we actually win to move us closer to that space, we would have to think of a campaign, right? So this year, what is that campaign that we can win that could actually be a precursor to getting us to cavity-free by kindergarten? So the way that we would start that is, if we started in different places, but it could be that we started as an organization. So SCOPE might be the lead of the coalition, and so we, with staff or maybe our executive team, we do a power analysis, right? So it's with a very small group of people doing some lead thinking of a power analysis. Then we might take it back then to our coalition members. Maybe it's a steering committee maybe it's the anchor groups of our coalition. The folks who are actually the decision makers of the coalition. And so we bring to them already some lead think, right? So we don't come in just with a blank power analysis, but already come with some thinking that we've done, some preliminary power analysis, and we have a conversation with them, right? And so they add to this power analysis because they bring a different perspective, they bring a different knowledge or area of expertise. And so we see that the power analysis is starting to evolve, right? And become even more specific. Then we might have, let's say the coalition then has a larger coalition membership. And so we might bring it to that larger coalition membership. And in that space, we might divide people into small groups to have smaller, deeper conversations, or we might do it as a big group. But then again, from starting as an organizational level to a steering committee level to a larger coalition membership, we start seeing how the power analysis starts to become more informed, it starts to be populated a little bit more just because, again, people are adding to it. But we also use it with, as I had mentioned previously, with our community members. So when we bring it to our community members, a lot of times it's a more solid power analysis. We've done some lead thinking, but we do it also just so that it's a better facilitated conversation. We bring already, some lead thinking around it, but obviously with the lens that the community members bring a wealth of information that we don't have because we might not be living in that specific community or being confronted with that specific problem. And so that we are very flexible to really make sure that the voice and the expertise of the community is in that power analysis. And so we're flexible to change and shift around. The one thing that I am going to say just to share is that the power analysis, whether you do it on on the wall and you take a picture of it, or you do it on a PowerPoint, this is your strategy map. This is the map of your plan. And so we make sure that we're careful that it's not circulated outside of the spaces that are folks are being part of the decision or part of drafting the power analysis, I should say. So it's not for wide distribution. It's a strategy plan, right? And so there's a lot of very critical information on the power analysis. For example, you are rating decision makers, and decision makers don't always like to be rated, right? And so you want to make sure that your power analysis doesn't land in the hands of one of the decision makers who you have maybe rated as a 4, and maybe you rated one of their colleagues as a 6. So just to say, when we're doing it with a larger group, the larger the group, we do use it as a PowerPoint presentation, and it becomes very interactive, but we don't necessarily make printouts and hand them out for bigger distribution.
There are no more questions, and I think you have left us with the most important piece of information. It is all strategy. It is all and it can be interpreted in so many different ways. For those of you who have questions and comments, you can share them with Gloria on her website, and you can also send them to me, mmanter@ohks.org. I think most of you have my email address in the information and the materials that we send out. Thank you, everyone. The next webinar will be in October, and it will be done by CADCA, and that is the National Organization Coalition on Drug and Alcohol Advocacy, and it will be on Coalition Building 101. They will continue to do another couple of webinars for us still in this year, and one will be on sustainability, and the other one will be on long-term planning. So thank you, everyone, for participating. There will be immediately after this, a very short survey, if you will take, and we appreciate it, and we will be looking forward to seeing you all again at DentaQuest meetings or other coalition meetings. Gloria, again, thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you for having me.